welcome to this panel. My name is David Passarelli. I am the director of the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. It is a think tank within the United Nations based in New York and in Geneva, and I work from New York. I have the great pleasure of being joined on this panel by three eminent experts of global institutions and regulation to think through how we build institutions to govern the digital space. So, brief introduction. I have Julia Morse next to me. She's a scholar of global governance of international institutions, which includes formal bodies and informal governance bodies like the Financial Action Task Force. And if you're interested in her work, she published a fantastic book in 2022 called The Banker's Blacklist, which demonstrates how the Financial Action Task Force has remade and transformed banking worldwide. She is an assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and was just recently, actually is still currently, a visiting fellow of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative in the UK. We also are delighted to have with us Julia Black. She is the Warden of Nuffield College at Oxford University and also the president of the British Academy, the UK's Academy for Social Sciences and Humanities. She is widely published and has published quite a bit on regulatory innovation, rules, and regulators, and will be speaking to lessons that we can take from the financial sector to think about the governance of the digital sector. And finally, we have Daria Gritsenko. She is an associate professor of digital social science at the Center for Social Data Science at the University of Helsinki. Will soon move to Munich to take up a new position in algorithmic governance. And she explores the digital transformation of state and society through the lens of sustainability. And she recently published a really relevant article looking at lessons from environmental policy and governance and how that might be applied to the digital realm. With that introduction done, when I walked in, I saw this panel on digital humanism that has this slogan at the bottom: that technology is not destiny and that we shape its fate. And the purpose of this session is to think about how we are building institutions to govern technology. And many of the messages that we've heard about digital humanism, what it is, that it is meant to sustain and advance democracy, human rights, inclusion, diversity. I think what digital humanism has provided is a language, a common language to speak about the challenges and opportunities of the digital space. And we might think of international organizations, the space of multilateral cooperation, in the same way, as providing a common language for the governance of digital technologies. It is a way of coming to agreeing shared values, a way of improving equity in terms of technology and resources, and a way of putting in mechanisms of accountability, among other things. Yesterday, in one of the opening keynote speeches, there was a quote that was shared with us, and the quote read, "The real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies." And I'm going to be a bit, I don't think provocative, but I do want to challenge that statement. I think it sells short the global institutions that we have. I think it sells short the ingenuity that we find in the multilateral system, in the different forms, the varied forms of cooperation that we have in the international system. I think it overlooks the way that we've governed different global challenges like aviation, nuclear cooperation, and infectious disease. And to borrow from a scholar of international institutions, Duncan Snidel, life today, I think, would be unmanageable without some of these international organizations. So we cooperate in many different ways, in many different fields, and in many different sectors, yet we don't really understand very well the process of inventing these institutions or how they borrow from one another. And that's what I wanted to bring this panel together to talk about today, is how we understand invention of institutions and innovation across institutions. The distinction might be that invention is the first creation of an institution, and innovation is the application of that particular form of cooperation in other spaces. And I think that helps us think through how the Secretary General in the UN is thinking about digital governance. If we think back to July 2023, The Secretary General is called before the Security Council, its first debate on the governance of artificial intelligence. And the Secretary General, in his first speech on this topic, proposes 3 different organizational models to govern AI. The IAEA, so on taking a template from atomic energy, the IPCC, and ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization. And I think what we see in the Secretary General's remarks is a deliberate attempt to innovate, to borrow existing models and to innovate how they are applied to the challenges of artificial intelligence. So this panel is going to be exploring this process. It's a term commonly used, or what is typically described as institutional mimicry, borrowing an organizational template from one space and applying it to the other. And the way we're going to proceed with this panel is Julia Morse will give us a history of institutional sociology, how we should think of global institutions and how we should think about this process of institutional mimicry and what evidence we see for it in the digital space. Julia Black will speak about the financial sector and what we can learn from regulation of the financial sector applied to the digital space. And Daria will speak about lessons from the environmental space, again applied to the digital space. So with that, I'd like to begin by offering the floor to Julia to kick off our presentations. We have one PowerPoint, I think, this morning. Julia, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So I'm a political scientist by training, and so I think it's helpful to maybe start by talking a little bit about trends in global governance. I'm a scholar of global governance, what we've seen in terms of global governance over the last 70 years. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the use of institutional mimicry, historical analogies, these kinds of comparisons and drawing on different existing institutions. So many of you probably know this, but the origins of most of what we think about in terms of global governance, international cooperation, the institutions that you're familiar with, things like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, almost all these institutions have their origins in the post-war moment. So 1945, this initial period is a huge period of growth and institution building. And since that time, we've seen essentially an explosion in international cooperation. Many of these organizations might be familiar with them, but many more are not. And I'm sure as we talk through the sort of some of the trends that you've seen, you'll see kind of how these patterns emerge and the degree to which so many areas of international politics and actually what happens to people domestically in their own states are governed by international cooperation. So this growth of institutions has led political scientists to ask why countries create international governance. And I think starting with the purpose of institutions is kind of useful as a conceptual framework. So one of the canonical theories on international governance, understanding why countries build institutions, identifies 3 kinds of reasons. Some international organizations do all 3 of these things. Some of them are really focused on one. So the first reason why countries build international organizations is to improve information. So this could be everything from establishing an agreed upon standard, what do we want, what does a responsible behavior look like, to facilitating the flow of information so that I know what other countries are doing, right? Countries can make commitments, but if I don't have insight into their actual policy, I might be worried about countries not following through. The second kind of thing that international organizations do is they really facilitate basically doing business across borders. So if you think about something like the Conference on Parties for Climate Change, multi-stakeholders get together every year to have conversations about climate change policy. And this is facilitated, this is made easy by a process where they know where the new conference is happening, people establish networks, there's connections made across parties. This makes it much easier to reach international agreements. So this is essentially reducing transaction costs. And then, of course, because it's international politics, one of the things we worry about are countries not following through on their promises. And so the third kinds of things that international organizations can do is basically increase the cost of reneging on promises, making it more likely that countries and the actors in those countries actually do what they say they will do. Okay, so this is just to give you kind of a conceptual framework for thinking about these institutions as we talk through them. Now I want to talk about two historical trends that I think are relevant when we try and draw on historical analogies and pull lessons from institutions for this space. Okay, the first trend is this is related to the growth of what's called formal and informal institutions across time. So the dark pink line on the top are formal IOs. These are things like the UN, like the World Trade Organization, like the World Bank, like the World Health Organization, organizations that are based on a treaty that are usually ratified by domestic legislators, that have a standing secretariat. They're much more formalized, probably the IOs that you're familiar with. And what I want to draw attention to is that there's a huge growth in these organizations basically until the end of the Cold War, and then it levels off. And I think this is important when we talk about what kind of analogies to draw on, because essentially countries don't really build these kind of institutions anymore. They're very rare. However, that doesn't mean cooperation is not happening. Cooperation has shifted to these kind of informal bodies. This is what we see in the realm of financial governance. These can be everything from the G20, right? Meetings like this between heads of state that occur annually, to things like the Financial Stability Board, things like the Financial Action Task Force, regulatory bodies. There's all different kinds of cooperation that take place in these bodies. They're often much more technocratic. They're not high profile. They're often not really politically loaded. But this is really where we've seen a major growth in cooperation in the last, say, 30 years. Okay, so the second trend that I would highlight is something that political scientists call regime complexity. And this is the idea that even within a single issue area, many different actors are involved in making policy. So here I'm giving you just an example. This is a network diagram of international cooperation to combat terrorism. And what you can see is that, yes, the United Nations and the UN Security Council are the central actors, right? These are important. But actually, there are many different organizations that are involved in policymaking in this issue area. And I would highlight this because sometimes I think we think from a cooperation standpoint, if we're thinking digital governance, we need one central overarching institution that's going to do everything. But actually institutions speak to each other, they differentiate responsibility, and there's ways in which they can work together. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about institutional mimicry and how this may be useful for digital governance. Okay, so why is institutional mimicry attractive? I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that the practice of drawing from existing institutions allows us to learn from successes and failures, right? So this makes sense when we're trying to design new policy. We want to look to institutions and think about what actually has worked in the past and maybe what has not worked so well. But the other thing that maybe is undersold is that this is a way of taking a really complex policy space and making it very accessible to policymakers. So if I write a 100-page proposal with laying out my design for an institution for AI governance, that's very difficult for a policymaker to digest. However, if I say I want to build an IAEA for AI, instantly most people know what I'm talking about, right? So there's kind of reasons for using these kind of heuristics. And so we see them all over, right? These are very common, not just from the Secretary General, as David mentioned, but from the tech industry, from policymakers. We get many uses of different kinds of historical analogies, calls for institutions in this context. In the AI space, which is the digital space I'm most familiar with, I'd say there's two kinds of ways that people think about drawing on technologies. The first is thinking about parallel technologies. So AI is a groundbreaking technology. What are other kinds of groundbreaking technologies where we might think about a parallel? The obvious example here is nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. And so we end up thinking, okay, well maybe the IAEA is a great analogy to look for. The other kind of approach is focusing on a different aspect of AI, which is the fact that the technology really sits in the hands of the private sector. So we're really talking about regulating a private sector actor. And so maybe we look at civil aviation or something like that because that's cooperation sort of focused in that manner. The other kind of common approach, I would say, is just thinking of big cooperation problems that are really high profile. And here, of course, the natural one that people think about, what else seems to pose an existential threat? Oh, well, let's look at climate change, right? So that's where we naturally draw our attention. Or sometimes people say, well, the challenge of AI is a cross-border challenge, so let's think about something like financial regulation. And so what I would say is there's nothing inherently wrong with these kind of approaches, but there are some potential cautions that I would note. So the first is that there are very significant differences in what political scientists would call the underlying cooperation problem between some of these analogies. So most importantly, nuclear weapons are controlled by governments, right? So as an analogy, governing the space of AI, where the technology sits in the hand of the private sector, it just has to look very differently from nuclear weapons. And on climate change is maybe not as slow-moving as it used to be, but compared to the pace of change in AI, the IPCC takes 5 years to write a scientific report. Imagine a scientific report on AI that took 5 years. I mean, it would essentially, I don't know that it could be of any value at all, right? So there are some very obvious differences here. Similarly, I think one thing that often gets missed is that there are implicit ideological content that comes along with these analogies. So if I want you to take AI really seriously and heavily regulate it and view it from a security framework, I'm going to tell you you need an IAEA for AI, right? That sends a very specific kind of signal. If I want maybe more of a hands-off scientific consensus approach, I'm going to say, well, let's look at the IPCC. Let's just sort of put knowledge out there. Now, this may or may not be appropriate to the cooperation problem, but it's important to kind of acknowledge that this is part of the dynamic that plays. So how do we think about using institutional mimicry more responsibly? So I would say, I think that's returning to kind of that framework I offered. I think it starts with thinking about what is actually the goal of cooperation. Is the problem that we don't have information, that we don't know what safe AI looks like? Is the problem that we don't know what countries are doing, our tech industries are doing? Or is it a problem where really we just need people in the same room to build some kind of bureaucratic network? Or alternatively, are we worried about cheating? Are we worrying that people are going to make commitments and not follow through? So all of these require different kinds of institutional design. And starting with the sort of understanding of different incentives of the people in this space, I think allows you to pull on the best analogies. I also would highlight, I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost is political context. Again, remember that slide of the growth of informal organizations. We can all talk about how great it would be to have an international treaty on AI, but I don't think many people think that's realistic right now. However, we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? You can actually get cooperation. Cooperation can evolve, and we have kind of the possibility of these regime complexes. And so I think progress can be incremental. So just some concluding thoughts. Institutional mimicry has a lot of possibilities. I think it makes it easy to make interventions in this space. And it can be used and deployed responsibly, but we just have to be aware of kind of the strengths and limitations of these approaches. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia. And to your point about the IPCC, the criticism that it takes too long, just this month, member states in New York are negotiating the modalities resolution of a new international scientific panel on AI risks. It was one of the major outcomes of the negotiations that took place in late 2024. It was one of the ways of taking forward the Secretary General's urging to improve international governments, international engagement on AI. And the modalities resolution today, while not yet adopted, requires reporting twice annually on the work of the panel. So we're improving on the 5-year kind of reporting. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We'll come back with some questions in a moment. Julia Black, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to nest my comments within the framework that Julia's really helpfully set out. And I'm wishing at this point that I had a slide, which I have slides, but I didn't bring one with me, which shows just the institutional complexity, in this case, of the financial regulation space. So I work in the area of financial regulation, but I also look at the regulation of almost anything. And I've been doing this for so long that the phrase regulatory governance wasn't even invented when I started out looking at regulation. In fact, we even had to design what we were deciding as regulation to be. But just to reiterate, because one always needs to reiterate these things, Regulation, regulatory governance is, in my very simple language, getting people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do and getting them to continue to do that when you're not looking. Now, the who is getting who can be a state to an individual, a state to a state, an individual to an individual, private. And the issue about hybridity and that you can have combinations of public and private kind of governance regimes is absolutely de rigueur. Okay, there are no brownie points for noting that. That is a very well observed phenomenon. For some reason, European lawyers find this really, really difficult to, and if I was in a legal context, then they'd be arguing about private law and public law, and this is a really complicated and really important divide. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, we're much more fluid about these things, so we can cope with these things. So what I want to just think about is actually delve in and take some of those kind of cautions about institutional mimicry and what it is we actually need to understand. First, about the domain that we're seeking to regulate, if we're regulators, and then about the kind of the possibilities of doing that in the institutional, in different ways on an international basis. When I think about regulatory systems, I think about them as having a number of different elements. The first are what are the goals and values, right, that this regulatory system is trying to achieve. So we've had a lot about goals and values, and just a fantastic lots of different insights around that at the conference already. Then the second, very linked to that, is what's the cognitive framework? What are the epistemologies and what are the narratives? Which, in other words, what is the conception of the problem? To the point that Julia was just making. How is the problem being understood? How is the domain that you're trying to regulate being understood? What are the and linked to that are therefore what are the knowledge sources which are being drawn on, and what are the narratives which are being built? And this is a really important part of a regulatory system. And we just saw a fantastic presentation from Christian, which just demonstrated that your regulatory system goes in very different directions, okay? Depending on, even if you've got the same overall kind of statement and assertion of the same goals and values, it moves in very different directions depending on how you're understanding the problem, what the kind of the key narratives are, what the kind of main cognitive framework, and linked to that are obviously the knowledge sources you're going to be drawing on. Then in a very straightforward regulatory fashion, what do you have? You have a bunch of regulatory tools. Regulation, when it comes down to it, is a very simple process to explain, very hard to do. It involves the formulation of some kind of norms, could be of legal standing, could be of non-legal standing, could be of some kind of hybrid standing, some kind of monitoring activity that may or may not take place by the person who wrote the norms, may take place by third parties, and some kind of enforcement mechanism, which again may be distributed differently across the regulatory system. It may lie in the hand of individuals to enforce through private law, might lie in the hands of national organisations to enforce as public enforcers, could be in the hands of the international bodies, could be backed by law, could be not. So that's your core rules, and that's your kind of regulatory functions, tools and techniques. Then you also have then a bunch of organisations, the regulatory organisations, the institutional frameworks that Julia was just talking about. You've also there got the market actors and others that are in that space. Then you've got the individuals. There might be some key kind of policy entrepreneurs in there, key kind of corporate leaders. You've also got the issues about human behaviours and those who are interacting. And on that, in the financial markets, rational actor, pursuit of profit is absolutely the only activity which is taking place. The wonderful thing about financial, you can say what you like about financial institutions, and people say a lot, but they are not hypocritical. They are not pretending to save the world. They are not pretending that they're doing this for public value or for public good. They are not pretending that there is any public value about this at all. They are there to make money. And that is absolutely what they do. And then finally, there's the legitimacy of this whole structure, right? Which is in terms of, again, the norms and values it's pursuing, how effectively it's doing that, the way that it's doing that, and the democratic accountability participation. Right, so that's the kind of edifice. So how does financial regulation kind of slot into this? First of all, thinking about the dynamics, financial regulation has been going on for a very long time. Financial markets are hundreds of years old. Money is millennia old. So this is a very old technology. It's been built also on the basis of law. So we don't have a situation where you can have a technology or activities which are independent of a legal regime. Financial instruments are legal instruments. Okay, one of the issues has been the recognition of those legal instruments on a transnational basis, which was kind of sorted out with bills of exchange through the Medicis in the 1400s and 1500s. So you've had a long time of financial markets. So what you've then had in terms of the regulation thereof and the move into from the private regulation through contract into the public regulation has happened, yes, in the 20th century, but the evolution of the international institutions has always been predicated on the understanding that financial flows are global. And so they will transcend national jurisdictions. So the earliest, going to the informal institutions here, they are the informal bodies, both of the technocratic layer of government. Okay, this is the regulators through the international cooperation. And in securities, that was the early 70s. For banking, again, the early 70s. You know, pensions, insurance is one of the latest, and that's in the early 90s. So you've had a long process of evolution and co-evolution, therefore, of the markets with regulation. And that is a very important distinction, obviously, to bear in mind. Then the other thing that's happened in terms of how you think about this and what we can draw from is that there are some useful things, however, to recognize, which is that financial markets and the principles, the goals have been well shared and understood for some time. So in securities markets, fair and efficient markets, appropriate investor protection, based on elements of disclosure for the financial system at whole, resilience, safety. However, institutional evolution has been punctuated by crises. So the situation we have now, which is the Financial Stability Board, which is really kind of head of global, as it were, emerged from a softer cooperation of the other security regulators after the financial crisis. And the body it evolved from, the Financial Stability Forum, emerged after the Asian currency crisis in 1999. So crises have punctuated the evolution, and it's been crises which have forced cooperation. Now, we might not necessarily want to wait for a crisis, but they're very good at mobilizing, as it were, and forcing in those centripetal forces that you need for international cooperation to work. What we're seeing now is as memories of the financial crisis fade, then you've got those centrifugal forces, people escaping, as it were, are much stronger, and you've got much higher levels of defection, for example, from the latest set of the, one of the sets of norms which is coming out. So you've had this long process of evolution, but you have also a very complex array, both of informal institutions and regulators, of banks, of insurance companies, of security industry, different configurations. If you were starting from here, it's very messy. You wouldn't start with this, but we have what we have. But in addition to that, you have very important private actors. So you have ISDA, which is the International Securities Derivatives Association, which sets the contracts for the global derivative markets. It writes the standard form contracts. So there's a standardization there. It's all just based on market actors. And actually, at the financial crisis, that actually organized an auction of those contracts so that people could clear their positions very quickly. So it will step in. You've also got the International Accounting Standards Board, which is, again, a group of accountants and leading experts who formulate the international accounting standards, not for the US, that it's not part of that, but again for the rest of, basically the rest of the world who set that. So you have these little epistemic units, as it were, which are integrated into this process, and you also have, for example, governments who are running payment systems are doing so on the basis of IOSCO standards. There's an IOSCO standard for a payment system. So you've got this very complex rule system, regime complex. So what are the things I think we can take from this? The first is that it's both ambitious and not very ambitious. So why is it ambitious? It's ambitious because it attempts to set global standards for all financial institutions, and some of these include the global, the global banks such as HSBC, Standard Chartered, Barclays, Goldman Sachs, etc., down to the local level, but it attempts to do so only at the very high level of principles. So we are not talking about detailed regulation. So it only at that very high level of, essentially, you must make sure you have a stable financial system, and here are the following 10 things you need to do to ensure that. And then it's for individual countries to then elaborate, etc. So ambitious, but not very ambitious, right? In the sense of keep it high level, and that also enables future-proofing and there's a lot of variation beneath that. Second is that it is ambitious, but not very ambitious in the sense that it has a monitoring mechanism. Ambitious, not very ambitious because it's not legally based, right? It's peer review. So it's there's a system of the top G20 economies have all agreed to be reviewed by their peers that come around periodically once every 5 years to review their system of financial regulation, an individual country's system of financial regulation, to see is it conforming with the global standards. And then they write a report. Is that ambitious and not very ambitious? Yeah, but it does kind of work. Why? Because you have this sort of global peer review of technocrats. Why? Because the people in the room are very similarly minded, right? And this is quite a closed epistemic community of experts, none of whom are that interested in defecting, even if their national governments and the politicians are, right? So you have this kind of process that works. And then thirdly, ambitious but not very ambitious in the sense that it tries to be all-inclusive, but you have very different populations and actually the groups. So IOSCO is practically every country in the world, so is the insurance. The banking one is much more concentrated, but then you have different fora where other different countries can put their points of view. So inclusivity, but whilst recognizing really where power lies and allowing those power dynamics to flow through in the way that the kind of the global norm setting is done at that very, very high level. So there are many different things that I could draw on, but I just wanted to just draw out, as I say, using some of the framework of what is it we need to understand in order to understand why we can draw analogies and where we can't. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daria. I'm going to come back to you with a question about peer review later, because you pointed out how important standard-setting communities are in financial regulation, and peer review principally made up of technocratic experts that are the foundation of that standard-setting community. So is it not a powerful mechanism actually to lay deep foundation? So, can peer review actually be seen as a much more ambitious and effective tool if we wanted to? I mean, this is what the UN is in a sense, developing is an international scientific panel, a form of peer review, a form of collective scientific assessment. But I'll come back to this a little bit later. Daria, the floor is yours. Lessons that we can take from environmental governance, one of these global challenges where multilateral cooperation has been essential. What can we take from that space and apply to the governance of the digital space?
Thank you, David. I want to start by asking you a question that may appear a bit odd to begin with, but bear with me for a moment. And I want to ask you, can you please raise your hand if you have some fleece jacket at home of any kind of fleece garment? Fleece? Anyone? Anyone owning fleece? Okay, quite many. You probably know that fleece clothing is mainly made of polyester. And polyester is a significant source of microplastic pollution. You put your fleece jacket into the washing machine, then microplastics goes down the drain. It's not caught by our wastewater treatment facilities. It goes down the ocean and contributes to marine plastic pollution. Marine plastic pollution is really among the biggest environmental challenges of our times. Let's look a bit at the DNA, so to say, of this specific problem. Plastic pollution travels across oceans, affects multiple countries. So what do we get? Cross-border impacts, right? Global plastic waste also lacks transparency. We don't exactly know where and how it comes from, and it's very often misreported. Plastic production and waste are increasing in our world very fast, and there are new types of plastics, so regulation cannot keep up. And we have very different stakeholders with conflicts. We have developed countries that push for complete ban of single-use plastics. We all drink from paper straws right now. Yeah. And then developing countries may resist, citing economic growth and jobs. in the industry of producing plastics. We have industry lobbyists, we have environmental NGOs, we have this whole complex of conflicting interests, and on top of it, a couple of years back, marine scientists reported that they found some bacteria that seem to actually like plastic and decompose it. They eat it. The evolution is at work also here. So, if we would like to be the doctors of global governance and diagnose this problem, we would diagnose it as a wicked problem with low governability. So, wicked problems, standard vocabulary of policy scientists, are problems that are ill-defined, value-laden, and they lack an optimal solution. If we have high complexity and uncertainty, if we have multiple stakeholders with conflicting goals, if we lack centralized authority or enforceable rules, if there are no solutions and only trade-offs, we say what we have is a wicked problem with low governability. Now let's look at another wicked problem with low governability: algorithmic bias in AI systems. Why so? Well, we can actually cite a lot of similarities at this specific level. We again have cross-border impacts. Algorithms developed there, affect people all around the world. Regulation may be national. We lack transparency. We talk about black boxes. It's very difficult to review these algorithms. Many are proprietary. Bias can be introduced at different levels, at data collection or labeling or model design or deployment. We again have conflicts of interests within the development of the algorithms, right? We want algorithms that are fair and accurate and transparent and efficient at the same time. And on top of it, we have big tech, and we have NGOs, and we have governments that all may have their own ideas about how this should develop. And we have very fast evolvement of these systems, so we again have problems of keeping up with them. So on the surface level, obviously, marine plastic pollution and algorithmic bias in AI are not, in any way similar. But if we look at the DNA of these issues as policy problems, then we can say, well, they actually bear family resemblance. I guess this is something that is appropriate to say in this city, right? So this family resemblance is actually a good news, because it can help us to find governance models and identify key features that promote effective governance strategies in the digital world. So it means that learning is possible, and environmental policy and governance scholarship has some valuable lessons for us. We know how hard it is to govern something that is complex, that is uncertain, that is fast-moving, like an environmental crisis. But environmental politics and governance has a few insights. And this literature, I digested for you now, and obviously it's very crude simplification, but believe me, this is roughly along the lines of what it is. So an environmental problem is more likely to be addressed successfully if the issue does not only make it to the top of the agenda and everyone makes an alarm discovery and everyone is like, oh my God, this is really bad. It also needs to stay there. It needs to stay there for long enough. Number two, variety of groups who have a stake or will be influenced by the problem are engaged in problem solving, some kind of collaborative decisions. Three, different policy domains are aligned. Environmental problems, they tend to touch upon various policy domains, right? And we need to see them horizontally rather than compartmentalize them. And we call it, in technical jargon, policy integration. That's the third component of success. And the fourth one is stakeholders actually trust each other. Not an easy one, but we know that if these four things happen, we are much more likely to find an effective solution to an environmental problem. So these conditions help explain why some environmental challenges gain traction and are being addressed more effectively than the others. And so they offer potentially valuable clues for shaping more effective governance in other complex fields like digital cooperation and the governance of AI. And now I want to share with you three big lessons that we can take from this literature again and potentially think whether they are useful for digital cooperation and AI. So the first one is leadership. Leadership, and especially personal leadership, is one of the most important and yet overlooked factors of success. What do leaders do? Well, first of all, they are very good at shaping new agendas, bringing things to the top, but also they are good for building bridges between complex problems and people who need to care about these problems. And these leaders, they can come from anywhere. They can be from the government, from the science community or civil society, private sector. Think of Rachel Carson, Gro Harlem Brundtland. Think about Al Gore or Greta Thunberg. Each of these figures has played an enormously important role in environmental cooperation. They're symbols of certain environmental movements. They were defining environmental problems, bringing them to public attention. Obviously, we can't just manufacture new leaders, but we should absolutely recognize how essential personal leadership is when we think about governing complex problems such as digital governance or AI. Yesterday, in one of the keynotes, Moshe Vardi was talking about the importance of activism, and I would like to add to this and say, well, it's not only activism that doesn't have a face, but also faces and personal leaders can and help drive political momentum that is needed for real change. Second lesson to be learned is what already has been quoted here, epistemic communities. It's a fancy word for knowledge networks or networks of experts who hold trusted policy-relevant knowledge in a specific field. They, like leaders, help raising attention, but also their key role is sustaining, right? They help keeping things on the agenda for long enough until some institution building starts happening, some problem solving starts happening. And they also are really good for building trust because they create shared language and shared understanding. They help with this part of the puzzle. Great example is IPCC, because IPCC in fact is an institutionalized epistemic community. Through global scientific assessments, it has helped governments and societies to better understand climate change and its risks and what could potentially be done about it. In the AI space, I would argue we're still grappling with the basics. What are the real issues? What are actually the problems? What do we already know? What's the potential scale and impact of what we know? What kind of responses are available? So I think it's no coincidence that IPCC is so often being quoted in relation to AI. There are actually, people have this intuition, this is something that we need. We don't have this shared understanding, we're not speaking the same language, we don't have answers to these very basic questions yet. We need some kind of a strong, trusted community of experts to help us answer these questions. And finally, the third lesson is polycentric governance. Again, fancy term, but a simple idea. Multiple centers of authority, all working under a shared vision. The most important feature of polycentricity is overlapping competences, duplication of functions, and redundancy. This type of governance has long been seen as a pathology that we need to get rid of because we don't need duplication, we don't need overlap. But brilliant scholarship of Elena Ostrom has showed us that it's actually very useful and functional to have overlaps, to have redundancies, and to have duplication. Now we know that polycentricity and how it's built, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a really important feature of governance. And in the realm of climate governance, we got Paris Agreement that is the best we were able to build in terms of polycentric governance, institutionalized polycentric governance, because on the one hand, it does offer a very clear and relatable 2-degree goal. It may be naive, you may criticize this, but actually everyone, it's so easy to communicate, 2 degrees, right? We don't have something as simple and relatable for AI yet. But I would argue this is roughly the direction we should be going into. And on the other hand, Paris Agreement allowed room for different countries, different institutions, and different sectors to work in the way that is possible for them. How to go there is not prescribed, right? So polycentric governance makes room for diversity, it encourages collaboration between different stakeholders, it helps managing complexity. At the same time, it does bring more eyes and more hands into decision-making process. And the consequence of this, the positive consequence of this, is that we increase the demand for transparency, for oversight, for ethical standards, and this is what helps us catalyze trust. And we remember that trust was one of the 4 preconditions for successful addressing of environmental problems. So while the idea of polycentric governance is counterintuitive at the first glance, we have evidence that this is the way to go if we want to address wicked problems with low governability. Summing up, we already know a lot about what works in global governance. And as we face the challenges of governing AI and digital technologies, we don't need to start from scratch. And quite honestly, we don't have time to start from scratch. The digital world is moving fast, and we need to use what we've learned from different sectors and from environmental governance. I'm just most familiar with that. And I believe that this type of analogy drawing can really help us to move forward more quickly and more wisely. Thank you.
That was so compelling. Thank you so much, Daria. I think what I take away from this is how often the ingenuity in global governance was created around one problem, but we find it actually being quite relevant and useful in solving unanticipated problems. And this is the moment that we are in at the present time. I want to put one question to all 3 of you. I sit in New York where we negotiate reform of the international financial architecture, we negotiate environmental regulation, data governance, AI governance, a range of issues. The political dynamics that you spoke of matter a great deal. And the World Economic Forum in January, so just a few months ago, published a report saying that interest in global cooperation is at an all-time low. And so my question is, what can we take from existing models of governments, existing agreements, ways of working together that might inspire trust? And is there a need to increase the supply of models to build confidence that you can participate in a multilateral forum with and develop a governance architecture that will see your interests reflected in the final architecture? Is there a way to reference past models, past negotiations, past treaties, to in fact encourage people to re-engage in international cooperation? So if we're sitting across the G77, the group of global South countries who are skeptical of the OECD or of the Bretton Woods institutions, can we present to them models of cooperation and say, well, these models are places that you have a voice, that have worked for the international community, and use that as an inducement to re-engage with international cooperation? What can we take from the existing landscape of international organizations, formal or informal, to induce greater interest in cooperation in multilateralism more generally, particularly when it comes to the digital world?
Sure. You want me to go?
Sure, I'll go this way.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of 2 different approaches that I would say. And I think, I think that is a really good place to start, because it's the declining support for multilateralism is basically all over, right? And so we are facing different problems from the United States right now, but the global South countries, the G77, there's skepticism kind of in different places, and the origins of the skepticism is a little different. And so I think that maybe means there's 2 different kinds of approaches. One that works fairly well and maybe hasn't been tried, it's been tried a little bit in the sort of the digital governance space, is to use existing institutions and essentially repurpose them, right? So if there are institutions that already have legitimacy, expanding mandates to kind of have them involved in some conversations can be useful, particularly as putting out forums, as trying to develop whether that's best practices or principles to draw on what already exists, because those institutional procedures are already in place. And so I think that's kind of one approach. Another approach is to think about governance in the context of, honestly, more micro-level issues. So I think it's really hard to get cooperation on something like AI, because we can't even agree on what AI means, right? And the conversation before this, talking about ethical principles, right, showed us that even the dialogue, the narratives are completely different in different places. And so when you talk about AI in G77 countries, people see economic opportunity. When you talk about AI in the UK, they're concerned about safety and security. And those are quite different priorities. And so I think there's maybe a space for a high-level conversation and shared conversation and principles and orientation, and that's what this new panel will hopefully kind of help establish. But there's also a space, I would say, for communities of like-minded states and bureaucratic networks to work together on strengthening cooperation around very specific targeted issues. And what we know from other areas of governance is that sometimes what it takes are 10 countries starting off saying, okay, we care about this particular aspect of policy and we're going to work together on this. And gradually we are going to bring our standards that we've adopted to bigger forums, to regional bodies, to the UN, and see if we can get them legitimated in that way so that we've thought about this process. And so I think, to me, those are kind of the different ways that you think about overcoming the political impasses that we have right now.
That's great. Thank you so much. And it reminds me of your presentation on the IAEA and the reasons why the IAEA has been referenced so much in AI governance, because it has a like kind of technology that is trying to be governed. But another reason it is often referenced is because of the way the IAEA got started, which is actually a very small number of countries, a technical community that expanded over time to actually have greater legitimacy in a particular sector. So kind of a useful way of thinking about these groups of like-minded states, these small communities that can expand over time, a way to ratchet up ambition. Thank you so much for the answer. Julia Black.
So listen, so I completely agree with that, and I think just to add to that, so just as a little example of that, growing up at that technical level, and I think there are two things to bear in mind here. One, are we getting governments to cooperate, or are we getting the technocratic layer of policymakers to cooperate? It's much easier to get the technocratic layer to cooperate, I think. And if you look at the growth of the informal bodies, as opposed to the formal bodies, the big political grandstanding, silverback gorillas are out there, kind of fora. The technocratic are, the much more low-level, just getting the job done with really detailed analysis and understanding. And often, to the point about shared values, we all know you go much further when you're working with people who share your worldview and your values, right? And so if I take IOSCO, which is 176 countries now, that started off in the 70s as a North America with the South American countries agreeing just at the technocratic level to get together to harmonize some of their securities laws, because you've got cross-investment, right, coming across. And then it grew out to include, randomly, it would appear, the UK, France, and Korea. Actually, South Korea is a really interesting player in all these different regulatory fora. It's always there, very active. And then it grew out. But so there's a growth model there. Then the other one, however, which I think is a really interesting one, just to sort of elaborate on the themes that Julia's laid out there, is the International Accounting Standards Board, because that has no government involvement whatsoever. That was born of frustration, but this time of accountants who, you've got finance wants to invest in different countries, but in companies in different countries, but you need to be able to understand the financial position of a company, right? It's really tedious if German companies are reporting in one way and French companies in another, and Belgian in another, and Korean in another, etc. If they all report in the same way, then you've got commensurability. And you can then decide, is that German company a better or worse bet than that French company, than that Korean, et cetera, et cetera. And so they started to formulate amongst themselves just some technical standards that they as professionals would recognize. So this was kind of going nowhere, however, until you have the EU at the time was trying to formulate international sort of accounting standards for the EU countries. They couldn't agree because the French wouldn't agree with the Germans and da-da-da. So they said, just, do you know what? We've got a problem. There's a solution sitting over there. We'll take that solution. So in other words, they enrolled. So you've got a private body that was enrolled by a group of a public sector governmental organization to do one of its regulatory jobs for it, as it were. Now, that raises all sorts of other issues, but that's another interesting way where you can get this evolution through enrollment, as it were. So you have the private sector bodies enrolling and being enrolled by government organizations. So I think what we're saying here is that the challenge we have here is speed, right? We're talking about things which have evolved over decades and decades and decades. And we don't have that time. But nor should we necessarily say, well, it's all moving too fast, so what do somebody expect us to do there? Just say, oh, well, you know, we give up then. No, of course we're not going to give up, right? But it's just we need to start, but we need to start small, and don't be afraid of doing that, because yes, then you can get a dynamic to grow.
Thank you so much, Julia. And this point of enrollment is something that you and I have been discussing in the context of the SOLAS Convention, which, for those who don't know, and I didn't know, is the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea. And it has a similar mechanism of enrollment. So yesterday, part of the conversation was about how do you incentivize the private sector? How do you constrain the private sector? How do you work with the private sector? It has its own incentive profit motivations. And so how do you find the nexus between the public regulatory ambition and the profit motivation of the private sector? And this concept of enrollment is actually potentially a very useful one in the governance of AI and the digital space. And perhaps you could speak a little bit about the SOLAS Convention and this mechanism of enrollment, because I think there is a parallel, but also answering the broader question of how do we induce greater interest in multilateral cooperation on the governance of AI and digital technologies, where we can find examples. Thank you.
Right. I have some background in understanding how shipping sector works and how regulation of maritime shipping works. Let's not take a complete example from them, because any new shipping regulation has been introduced after a major disaster. 1914, we had the Titanic disaster, and that was the moment where states came together and said, ooh, we'd better do something about safety of life at sea, and this is how SOLAS Convention in principle has been born. And the idea there was that we will just say how you build safe ships, right? But it is a bit of a difficult thing to do, because ships have been evolving, right? And you have new materials, you have new ways of propulsion. You can't really put it down. If you just say, build safe ships, that's too open. If you go after each and every screw, that's not gonna be sustainable. So what do you do? In 1974, right, when the SOLAS Convention has been reformed and took its contemporary shape, there has been a super interesting mechanism written into it. So some things are really very prescriptive, they're very technical in the convention. And then it also says that classification societies are enrolled in this language into this process. They should mandate how ships are to be designed, how the hull is to be designed, how a propulsion is to be designed, and so on. So what are classification societies? The shipping industry is full of extremely interesting bodies. Classification societies is this third-party organization, so it's a kind of a private sector organization that serves simultaneously the flag state and the ship owner. It does both. So on the one hand, it classifies ships. It goes and inspects them annually and says, well, yes, you are indeed belonging to this class, you have all these properties on your ship. And at the same time, it does it on behalf of the flag state, so the state which ship is flying their flag, right? And it does this, so it has the regulatory mandate, but it also is working for the ship owner at the same time. And it is explicitly mentioned in the SOLAS Convention that they have this very important role, because they are within the industry and they know best what the current most safe way of constructing ships would be. This is how it works there. Well, they have another fascinating things, you know, they have the port states and they have insurances, they have protection and indemnity clubs. They just have so many parties basically doing the same thing. Shipping industry is regulated in a very polycentric manner. And we could look into it into more detail. It's an interesting industry.
I'm just going to come in on one point. One group we haven't mentioned so far are those third-party actors who are not formally enrolled in a regulatory system, but they do a really important job, and they are the insurance companies. So we're already starting to see insurance products. So you mentioned, so shipping is huge. Anything to do with health and safety. Then you've got your national regulations or others, but then your insurance companies are the ones that really bite. Okay, really, really bite. So it's going to be interesting to see what insurance products are going to come out in relation to AI. So I just saw launched on the Lloyd's market, which is the biggest global insurance market, insurance against chatbots. So chatbots giving people erroneous financial advice, for example. Financial regulation, you've got rules of best advice, da-da-da. So if your chatbot now does something, which means you cross a regulatory line or cause some kind of legally recognizable harm, you'll have an insurance claim against it. Now, insurance companies don't do this for free, obviously, so they are trying to assess the probability of that risk crystallizing, assess the damage which is likely, set the premium accordingly, but also set various conditions. I'm sure if everybody got home insurance, yeah. Everybody's home insurance requires that you have window locks, whether or not you have the window locks, whether or not they're locked, have an alarm. So in other words, various safety features that the insurance company is requiring you to have to minimize the risk, that risk crystallizing, minimizing the probability of that risk crystallizing. Why are they interested in doing that? Because they don't want to pay out. So I think there are some really interesting third-party actors here, notably insurance companies, that we shouldn't ignore as being de facto standard setters in the AI space.
That's a brilliant example. Thank you so much. Thank you both, and for walking us through the intricacies of maritime regulation. I think it's fascinating what opportunities there are there. The purpose, we have questions. Now we're going to go to questions. We have many questions, so I'm going to stop speaking. 1, 2, 3 to begin with, and 4 in the back. We have a microphone that we're going to circulate. Why don't we do 2 questions, and then we'll take the answers, and then we'll do 2 more questions. So to the gentleman over here in the second row, and then the lady right behind him.
Hi, thanks. Michael Veal from UCL Laws. I have a question for Julia primarily Julia Black. So you were talking about the financial services industry and similar, and in the digital world, techno-regulation is really important. We can call it design-based regulation or architecture or code or all these kind of things that fall by it. And what we're seeing in this industry, the AI industry, is a huge amount of private governance and a huge amount of techno-regulation. We've seen that historically in internet governance. And we've also seen that happen quite illegitimately, arguably, with very little control. And because of digital technologies, it's very powerful if you set informational rules. I don't know if you've got any analogies, perhaps, from the financial industries or other industries of times when there's been oversight of techno-regulation, where the actors have had very powerful abilities to set rules, informational rules in markets, but that's required almost a meta level of regulation to oversee that. Because I think that's where we are, digital rights management and code and hardware in this space. And we see some of that, but I'm interested to know if there's lessons that we have there. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go to the second question. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to hear the answer. Okay, yeah, I'll continue. Thank you very much for this so very inspiring and thought-provocative panel. And I really do not know to whom I would address my question. And I don't know, maybe to the other Julia, but maybe for all of you. So, so the first thing one starts to do is just to find different analogies in different industries, so with what we could compare. So I was thinking about this civil aviation, so this should be some private and governmental also important, but I do not like this airplanes because they're very big and the airports are very also big, and actually individuals really do delegate the decisions to some big institutions. And so I was thinking about everything connected with health and medical protocols. So this is something which really has evolved a lot in the last years, like, and very science-based. So people do research and then they decide how to treat people, and then the individuals, like the doctors or the patients, they decide, okay, I will go to this doctor, I know that this doctor is following the best medical protocols, so perhaps this doctor will cure me. And this is kind of more, you know, more stakeholders are involved here, and perhaps it is like a little bit more like this AI digital thing where a lot of people are into it. And then the crucial point, which is not alike, which I understand, like listening to you and thinking, is actually this monitoring thing. Because what the health industry is doing is that to raise the trust of the audience, they do a lot of monitoring, studying how do people respond to the treatment, and they publicly they give these open reports, and actually it helps. It helps for the private companies to earn more money, but in the, say, AI sector, it's all in the opposite. Your data is your oil, and you do not want to share with your data. And actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but all the big monitoring thing of what is going with, I don't know, for example, with large language models nowadays in different languages, they seem to me very, very superficial. Like, okay, we have 10 languages very well represented in the internet, and that's all. But actually, these ChatGPT and generative models, they eat our data in different languages, and when we take less represented languages, we even do not know actually what is this language online. And I don't know who could be the stakeholders for monitoring to make decisions and to think about strategies based on data, like in other industries. Sorry for being so long.
No, that's fine, thank you. So I take the first question is about regulation. And the second question goes to the heart of international relations theory, which is the delegation of authority to international organizations, the centralization of authority and the independence of some of these organizations to act in a particular space. And then also the trust-building mechanisms that come with monitoring, transparency, inspections, if we're thinking about the nuclear space. And so the question here is one, a discomfort perhaps with some of this delegation of authority, but two, who could play this role of monitoring, I think was kind of the question you were getting at. So thank you for those two questions. I think if I can, I'll put the first question on regulation to Julia Black, and the second question, because it's IR theory, I'm going to put it to Julia Morse.
Okay, so on the first question of the private sector standard setters and power and oversight, etc. So yes, there are examples of that. So to go back to the International Accounting Standards Board, the standards that it was setting in relation to marking your assets to market, for example, is fine for a non-financial environment. In a financial environment, and it precipitated the crisis. So you had very direct, it wasn't just the power, it was actually their rules were precipitating the financial crisis as it unfolded. And so there was a need to kind of bring it into the regulatory net. And so again, you can have that. I think the challenge is that it tends to be a jurisdictional one. So where are these bodies located? If they're on your home soil, you can, and they're regulating for your little bit of the community, then you can go in. Obviously, that's not the situation we're in. And moreover, they're not on your soil. And it may be that, obviously, they're US companies, then you basically need a cross-government, some grouping of governmental actors to say, well, we will, if you are going to be my citizens, basically it's how extraterritorial works, territoriality works, my citizens are going to be affected by your service in some way, so you're now within my territorial reach, and then you can kind of reach over. So there are examples, it does get complicated, but if the political will, it's all down to political will, right? The political will is there, then anything can be done, right? Things can be worked through. I think just on the, if I may, just on the issue of the monitoring, I think what I'm getting there is that on the adverse reactions, it's the individuals, right? You're not relying on an organization, so it's the adverse indicators reporting, right? And you get a similar thing with health and safety, and firms themselves have to report on the adverse indicators. How do we know when an AI model has gone wrong? Because A, we don't know what it's meant to have said because we can't verify it, and B, it's in lots of different languages, so you don't have those monitors coming in. So I absolutely get that point. I think there are, again, various techniques for allowing those things to be captured and reported in. The challenge usually then is you've got so much data that actually a regulator can't manage it, but fortunately we'll have AI tools that could be able to do that for us. So, but I take the point about actually not just the delegation, but how do we get the monitoring on the ground of these things in practice. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think one way to answer your question actually is to go back to the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization analogy, and talk through why it might be attractive. So I think one of the reasons that it's useful is, of course, it's the regulation of private industry. It has sort of a community of states who are generally in charge, but then these really specific scientific bodies that govern a whole bunch of different technical standards. And they think about all different kinds of sort of risk modeling, safety, and different aspects of industry related to civil aviation. They come up with recommendations. Those get adopted sort of generally. And then the expectation is that the civil aviation adopts them. And the reason I think that's useful is because there's not really a technical enforcement mechanism for that. But what happens is that if it turns out that a country is not following these standards, large market places basically won't allow them to fly. So, you know, the EU or the US, places that basically firms need to fly to be competitive, will say we won't take planes from this place because they're not meeting these particular standards. And so even though there's not this direct sort of regulatory oversight, there is information being put out, and then there's this market mechanism that drives people to follow these recommendations. So why do I give this analogy? Because I think you're right that right now the stakeholders are a little bit unclear in the AI space. And so it's not exactly clear who is ready to punish, for lack of a better word, the tech firms if these models fall short. And so what I would say is I think that actually is maybe the goal, part of the goal of cooperation and regulation, is to think about how do we create a marketplace where there is a way to change the firm's incentives so that they do prioritize the things that we want them to prioritize. That can come from regulation in particular spaces. It can be governments acting and punishing companies for not doing things. But there's many ways that markets can generate incentives, right? Sometimes it's just by putting out their information about who's following standards and products, right? And if there are substitutes available, I decide, well, I'm a consumer, ChatGPT is as good as another, you know, AI bot, but I feel like this one's not as safe for whatever reason, and so I can shift my product, right? We can imagine maybe a world where maybe it's other firms stepping in. And so I think, like, unfortunately, the sad reality of this moment, part of what we need to think about governance from this perspective is basically, how do we think about shifting the marketplace so that firms have these underlying incentives so that it is a little bit more similar exactly to the medical field, where we might be able to say, okay, there are reasons why I want to include safety in my models, or I want to think about algorithmic bias and shift my models so that they're giving me output so that I don't get punished in some way. My profits aren't affected.
That's wonderful, thank you. We have 10 minutes left, and I saw a whole bunch of hands. Okay, so we had one here, one there. So we have 2 questions, and then we have 2 more in this angle. So I'll come back, and I see a hand in the back as well. Please, sir. And if you can identify,
Sure.
Just identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Nuffield Contractor from Northwestern University in Evanston. Thank you again for a great panel. It was really very stimulating. It brings to my mind a foundational paper that was written back in 1983 called The Iron Cage Revisited, which talked about institutional isomorphism, that is the extent to which you are looking across different institutions, DiMaggio and Powell. And in that, they talked about 3 mechanisms for isomorphism across structures of the kind that we're discussing here. The first one of them being mimetic, which is very similar to your use of the word mimicry. The second being coercive, that is, you coerce other people into doing things. And the third is normative, that is, you set up norms to do it. My question, with that as background, I have two questions that are related to each other. One is, in that article, they laid out the rationale for institutional isomorphism as not being to accomplish efficiencies or effectiveness, but mostly to accomplish legitimacy. So that if you talk like a duck, walk like a duck, you're going to be a duck. You'll be seen as a duck. So to what extent are we thinking about governance structures in the AI realm based on gaining legitimacy rather than efficiencies or effectiveness? That's question one. And question two, you've given wonderful examples of areas like climate, nuclear, aviation, navigation, shipping. And I was curious about the extent to which we may also learn some lessons, for better or for worse, from areas that are much more adjacent to AI, like the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that focuses on some of these areas, or the ITU, which is also working within this area, and then the World Summit for the Information Society, which arguably is another player. All of these three, what they have in common is that they are very tech adjacent to AI. And is there a reason why we need to go far out into other areas like nuclear, aviation, etc., climate change, rather than this? So those are the two questions, legitimacy and then.
Excellent questions, and I know the paper you're referring to. It was a foundational paper in the design of this project, so thank you for flagging it. The second question there, and then to you, I think you had a question, right? No? Oh, is it, yeah. Oh, the microphone is now there, I see. But go ahead.
Sorry. I hope it's not a stupid question. It's very foundational to the general approach. So all of you kind of stretch the analogy to evolution as a justification of why to do that. But why natural evolution works is because there is like this random mutation, and we try out a lot of different approaches. But that's not the case here, right? Because we specifically design a solution that mimics something. So to stretch the analogy, it's a bit more like intelligent design. We have like a creator that decides what we do, in that case like the experts and the technocrats. And yeah, so I want to know how we know that this approach actually gives like efficient outcomes, and not like when we do it from scratch, we may have vastly better outcomes that would justify, like what Daria mentioned, the great cost of doing it from scratch. And I would also direct it at Daria, if that's okay. Okay.
Great, we have two questions. Daria, you have one, that last question, and on this paper on institutional isomorphism, it also comes up quite a bit in the development economics literature. The term institutional mimicry gets used there, and it's actually a pejorative. The idea of transplanting approaches to development institutions without a wider ecosystem, a supported architecture around it. I mean, just I'm going to venture a first response, and then maybe I'll pass it over to Julia, who was part of a really interesting project that looked, just as the United Nations was setting up a scientific advisory panel on AI, that looked at many different models of governance to feed into it. But I think where we see the benefit, at least in our project, is the legitimacy side of this, is in explaining to member states that it goes to the point that Julia made earlier, that several platforms are legitimate forms of cooperation, and that it could induce greater cooperation, greater investment in this platform at a time when there is this general pullback. So from the point of view of our project, we see it as a great benefit is the legitimacy side of this, as opposed to the effectiveness side, but there are two different sides. So perhaps, Daria, I could ask you to go first on this random mutation. Just a quick correction there. I would argue also, just going back to the definition that we gave earlier of invention versus innovation. I think the innovation side is mutation. The invention side is creating something new. And if you look at the IPCC, it's been replicated 12 times, all in different ways. None of them exactly like the IPCC, but all variations and mutations of an original model. And so I think there is that mutation there. Please go.
Right, we only have 4 minutes left, so I try to be super quick. But actually, when I was talking about polycentric governance, the whole idea of polycentric governance is that we allow for these spontaneous ideas, for different forms and formats, and we can see in this process what works and what doesn't, and what works where. So in a way, you have these mutations, and then you see like, okay, that works best, that doesn't work so well. What's the biggest problem with polycentric governance? Well, one of the biggest problems is right now we are in this sphere where we don't have much regulation, and all the big companies know there will be regulation. There will be regulation. They want now to be in this space where regulation occurs, and they actually don't want polycentricity. What's the reason for that? Well, because in that case, regulation is diluted in multiple arenas, and it's, referring to yesterday, against their business model. Because the more overlap, the more legal complexity, the higher the compliance costs. You want to make business, you want to create profits, and then everywhere you need to start from scratch figuring out how do we do it here. Big tech would like to have as uniform regulation as possible and have as much say in it as possible. Is this what we know most effective? Not necessarily. So this is again where we need to maybe think about it. Should we roll with this, or should we say, well, what about we still experiment a bit around and take advantage of evolution?
Julia, you have the final word. Legitimacy versus effectiveness in institutional isomorphism.
So I would say I think that's a little bit of a false dichotomy. Of course, there's different aspects of legitimacy. There is a procedural version of legitimacy, and there's an outcome orientation of legitimacy. It's undoubtedly hurt the Security Council that they have failed to act on some of the major crises of the 21st century, and I think no one would say that that is irrelevant to sort of evaluating the legitimacy. So I think I would say I think the reason we draw on these kinds of analogies are to avoid just coming up with the things that are immediately accessible to us. So the project that David referred to was something I was involved with actually Microsoft, who was attempting to learn from the space of global governance and think more broadly and not just kind of draw on what's accessible. I think that's valuable both from a legitimacy standpoint in terms of negotiations, what do we know, what's worked, and also then from an outcome-based. So I certainly think with something important enough as AI, we don't want to just neglect what actually happens, right? We want to think about what it actually does, because governance is not all functional, I would say. Some of the governance that exists really doesn't do very much. And so we really want to optimize on things that are going to make a difference for something this important.
Thank you. I have 1 minute left, so I have time to give one thought and then to thank the panelists. And my final thought is that I think improving the supply of models, of governance models, investigating, taking that effort that Microsoft launched, expanding that effort, that's exactly what we're doing. We just launched a 3-year project looking at these different models of governance, but different specific mechanisms of governance, whether it's accountability, whether it's transparency, peer review, to see what we can learn. And our argument is that it improves the overall resilience of the multilateral system and is more likely to induce buy-in from governments who are somewhat reticent to cooperate right now. They're somewhat skeptical about the institution. So we want to demonstrate that it has worked in the past, that there is ingenuity, and then by supplying these models, hopefully they will come to the table and agree to regulate through the multilateral system. With that, I owe really tremendous gratitude to my panelists. You have been remarkable partners over the last few months as we prepared this panel. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you, the audience, for your wonderful questions and for spending the morning with us. Please join me in welcoming or thanking our panelists.